She was supposed to be invisible. Doris Hall, 29 years old, forensic document analyst turned nurse, had one job at Washington Memorial's private wing: monitor the vitals, administer the medication, and stay silent. But tonight, in the hospital's most secure suite, Eric Washington, the city's most feared mafia boss, is about to sign a $200 million document that will transfer control of his legitimate empire. The signature looks perfect. His consigliere swears it's routine. The legal team has verified everything. The timing is right. The witnesses are right. The format is right. Except it isn't. And Doris, standing at the bedside with a blood pressure cuff and her father's training burned into her memory, has exactly one chance to do the impossible: speak 4 words in Sicilian that will stop a catastrophic betrayal, expose her patient's most trusted advisor, and reveal that the invisible nurse adjusting his IV knows more about his handwriting than his own lawyers. The storm that hit the city that November evening wasn't dramatic, just the kind of cold, relentless rain that made the streets look slick and dangerous. In the private medical complex on Westbrook Avenue, where black SUVs with tinted windows idled at the service entrance and security wore earpieces year-round, Washington Memorial's executive wing rose 6 floors of reinforced concrete and absolute discretion. To call it a hospital was technically accurate but spiritually insufficient. The executive wing was where senators recovered from exhaustion, where CEOs had procedures that never appeared in medical journals, where men who controlled the city's underground came to heal in absolute secrecy. The staff protocol wasn't posted because if you had to ask, you didn't belong. And moving through this fortress of power every evening, carrying charts and wearing scrubs that might as well have been camouflage, was Doris Hall. At 29, Doris had become an expert at erasure. Her natural hair was always pulled back into a tight, professional bun that made her scalp ache by hour 10. Her uniform, navy blue scrubs, white nursing clogs, hospital ID clipped precisely to her chest pocket, was always immaculate. Her expression was always competent, but neutral. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, anticipating needs, executing orders, never drawing attention. She was invisible by necessity because if anyone looked too closely at her personnel file, they might ask questions. 5 years ago, Doris Hall had been the youngest associate at Castellano and Webb Forensic Documents, one of the most prestigious handwriting analysis firms in the country. Her expertise in signature authentication and forgery detection had made her a sought-after expert witness in federal fraud cases. She testified before grand juries, consulted with the FBI's white-collar crime division, and had a standing offer to join the Secret Service's counterfeit division. Her specialty was pen pressure variance and microscopic ink analysis, the invisible tells that separated authentic signatures from perfect forgeries. Then her younger brother got into trouble. Marcus Hall, brilliant and reckless, had borrowed money from the wrong people to cover medical school debt. The interest had compounded. The collectors had gotten aggressive. The final demand, $180,000 in 6 months, or Marcus would disappear. Doris had made a choice. Forensic document analysts made $95,000 a year. Nurses in the executive wing made that in 4 months, cash, no questions asked. So she disappeared. She let her certifications lapse, stopped returning calls from federal prosecutors, put her forensic tools in storage, and put on scrubs instead. She enrolled in an accelerated nursing program, leveraging her pre-med undergraduate background, and emerged 18 months later with an RN license and a new identity: just another competent, unremarkable nurse. That was 3 years ago. Marcus was still in medical school, the debt was down to $40,000, and Doris was still invisible. Until tonight. Hall! Charge nurse Patricia Chen had the kind of voice that could freeze morphine in a syringe. Suite 6, now. Eric Washington just came out of surgery. Post-op monitoring, 12-hour shift. He doesn't tolerate incompetence. The name meant everything to Doris, which meant she'd been paying attention for 3 years. Eric Washington wasn't just another patient. He was the reason the executive wing existed, the man whose network controlled half the city's construction contracts, whose legitimate businesses were worth hundreds of millions, whose protection extended to politicians, judges, and police captains. He was also the man whose signature Doris had studied 5 years ago during a federal investigation into construction bid rigging. The case had been dropped. The signature analysis had been sealed. But Doris remembered every loop, every pressure point, every microscopic variation in Eric Washington's handwriting. She remembered because her father had taught her that a signature wasn't just a name, it was a fingerprint of the soul. And tonight, in Suite 6, as Eric Washington lay recovering from emergency gallbladder surgery, weak and medicated and surrounded by his inner circle, Doris was about to see that signature again. She pushed open the door to Suite 6 at precisely 6:47 p.m., her nursing bag over her shoulder, her expression professionally blank. The room was designed to look like a luxury hotel suite: hardwood floors, leather furniture, a king-sized hospital bed with Egyptian cotton sheets. But the security camera in every corner and the two armed men flanking the door told the real story. Eric Washington lay propped against pillows, his normally commanding presence diminished by hospital gowns and post-surgical pallor. Even weakened, he radiated authority: salt and pepper hair, sharp features, eyes that missed nothing, or at least eyes that had missed nothing before the anesthesia. Standing beside the bed was a man in an expensive charcoal suit, mid-50s, silver hair, the kind of face that belonged in corporate boardrooms or confession booths. Silas Marks, Eric's consigliere for 20 years, the man who managed the legal empire while Eric managed everything else. "Mr. Washington?" Silas's voice was smooth, concerned. "I know the timing isn't ideal, but the Riverside development deal closes tomorrow. The investors need your signature tonight, or we lose the entire $200 million acquisition." Doris moved to the monitors, checking Eric's vitals with practiced efficiency. Blood pressure slightly elevated, heart rate steady, oxygen saturation good. Her hands moved through the routine while her mind cataloged everything: Silas's body language, the leather portfolio on the side table, the Mont Blanc pen already uncapped. "The legal team has verified everything," Silas continued, opening the portfolio. "All you need to do is sign the transfer authorization, and I'll handle the rest. You can focus on recovery." Eric's hand trembled slightly as he reached toward the pen. A normal post-surgical tremor, nothing unusual. Doris noted it automatically, the way she'd noted thousands of small physical details in 3 years of nursing. Then Silas placed the document on the adjustable bed table, and Doris's entire world narrowed to a single line of text. There, at the bottom of page 7, was Eric Washington's signature. Already signed, already authenticated, already witnessed, and completely, microscopically, perfectly wrong. Doris's breath caught. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "The pressure tells the truth, Doris. A forger can copy the shape, but they can't copy the soul." She saw it instantly. The signature was visually flawless, every loop and curve exactly where it should be. But the ink pressure was too uniform, too controlled. Eric Washington's authentic signature showed 3 distinct pressure variations: heavy on the initial E, lighter through the Ashington, then heavy again on the final flourish. This signature showed constant mechanical pressure throughout. It was the work of a master forger, possibly using a pressure-sensitive digital tool, but it wasn't Eric's hand. Someone had pre-signed the document, someone who knew Eric would be too weak, too medicated, too trusting to look closely, and that someone had to be Silas. Doris felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This wasn't her job. This wasn't her business. She was $40,000 away from saving her brother, $40,000 away from walking away from this world forever. Speaking up meant risking everything: the job, the money, possibly her life. But her father's other lesson burned even brighter. The word on the paper is a man's soul. When someone forges a signature, they're not just stealing money, they're stealing identity, and we don't stay silent when we witness theft. Eric's hand hovered over the document, ready to add his second signature, the one that would authorize the transfer. Silas smiled encouragingly. Just your signature, Eric. Then you can rest. Doris watched the pen descend toward the paper. She heard her father's voice. She felt her grandmother's Sicilian prayers. She saw the invisible thread of her entire life, forensic analyst, daughter, sister, nurse, pulling tight into this single moment. And she stepped forward. Non firmare. Her voice cut through the room like a scalpel. Questa firma è falsa. Don't sign. This signature is fake. The room froze. Eric's hand stopped. Silas's expression went from confusion to shock to something darker. The security guards tensed. Eric Washington's eyes, still sharp despite the medication, locked onto Doris's face. He spoke in the same Sicilian dialect, the language of family secrets and absolute trust. Explain yourself, nurse. Quickly. And Doris Hall, the invisible woman who had spent 3 years hiding her expertise, stepped fully into the light. Before we continue, click subscribe, like this video, and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and remember your support helps us create more interesting stories. Now let's get back into the story. Doris Hall learned about debt the same way most people learned about gravity, through painful, inevitable falls. The first fall happened when she was 7 years old, sitting at her father's desk in their cramped Bronx apartment, watching him examine a signature through a magnifying glass mounted on an articulated arm. Theodore Hall had been a forensic document examiner for 30 years, the kind of expert witness prosecutors called when million-dollar fraud cases hinged on 3 millimeters of ink variation. He worked from home after his firm downsized, taking freelance cases that paid enough to keep the lights on, and Doris's mother, Rosa, in the small comforts she deserved. See this, Doris? Her father's finger traced an invisible line across the paper. A signature is never just a name, it's pressure, timing, rhythm. It's muscle memory written in ink. When a man signs his name 1,000 times, his hand creates a pattern his brain doesn't even register. But the paper remembers. The paper always remembers. Doris had leaned closer, her 7-year-old eyes struggling to see what her father saw. He'd smiled then, that patient smile that made her feel like the smartest person in the room, and handed her the magnifying glass. You have the gift, Piccola. Your grandmother had it too. She could spot a forged letter from across a room. Said it was something about the way lies sat on paper, too neat, too careful. The truth is always a little messy. Her grandmother, Nonna Lucia, had come from Sicily as a young bride, bringing with her the sharp, ancient dialect of Palermo's old quarter and a suspicion of official documents that bordered on religious conviction. She'd taught Doris the language the way other grandmothers taught recipes, through repetition, correction, and the absolute certainty that this knowledge was survival itself. In Sicilia, Nonna Lucia would say, pressing Doris's small hand between her weathered palms, we trust the word spoken face to face, not the word on the government paper. But if you must read the paper, read it like your life depends on seeing the lie. Doris had absorbed it all, her father's technical precision, her grandmother's instinctive distrust, the Sicilian phrases that felt like secrets shared in darkness. By the time she was 16, she could spot signature inconsistencies faster than her father's colleagues. By 22, she had a position at Castellano and Webb, a salary that felt like wealth, and a future that looked nothing like the Bronx apartment where she'd learned to see what others missed. The second fall came without warning. Marcus, her younger brother by 3 years, had always been the brilliant one. Where Doris saw patterns in ink, Marcus saw patterns in human biology. He'd gotten into Columbia Medical School on a full academic scholarship, the pride of the entire family, the proof that the Hall children would escape the cycle of paycheck to paycheck survival that had defined their parents' lives. But scholarships didn't cover living expenses in Manhattan. They didn't cover the textbooks that cost $400 each, or the medical equipment students were expected to purchase, or the professional wardrobe required for clinical rotations. Marcus had done what thousands of desperate students did. He'd borrowed money. Not from banks, which required credit he didn't have, but from a loan service that promised flexible terms and student-friendly rates. The flexible terms had turned predatory within 6 months. The student-friendly rates had compounded into a nightmare that no amount of part-time work could touch. By the time Marcus confessed the truth to Doris, the debt had metastasized to $180,000, and the collectors had started making the kind of threats that didn't appear in official correspondence. "They know where I live," Marcus had told her, his voice shaking over the phone. "They know my schedule. Last week someone followed me home from the hospital. Doris, I don't know what to do." Doris had known exactly what to do. She'd grown up watching her father navigate the space between official channels and street-level reality. She'd learned from Nonna Lucia that family debt was blood debt, and blood debt was paid regardless of the cost. She'd liquidated her savings, $40,000 that represented 5 years of careful financial planning. She'd negotiated with the collectors, buying Marcus time and a reduced payment schedule. And then she'd made the calculation that changed everything. Her forensic analysis career would take 15 years to clear the remaining $140,000 while keeping Marcus safe and finishing his degree. Nursing in the executive wing would do it in 3. The math was simple. The choice was impossible. She'd made it anyway. That was 3 years ago. Her father had died 2 years ago, a heart attack at his desk, his magnifying glass still illuminated over a signature he'd been analyzing. Her grandmother had followed 6 months later, as if she'd only been waiting for Theodore to go first. They'd both died believing Doris had simply changed careers, pursuing a more stable path in healthcare. She'd never told them about Marcus's debt. She'd never told them she was erasing herself. Now, at 29, Doris lived in a studio apartment she barely saw, worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, and sent every spare dollar to the collectors who had agreed to extend Marcus's deadline as long as the payments kept coming. She had $40,000 left to pay. 4 more months of invisibility, 4 more months of being the competent, unremarkable nurse who never asked questions and never drew attention. 4 more months of pretending she didn't see the signatures on documents, the tells in handwriting, the microscopic lies that her father had trained her entire life to detect. She carried her father's magnifying glass in her nursing bag, wrapped in a soft cloth. She'd never used it at work. She'd never needed to, until tonight. Suite 6 existed in a separate reality from the rest of Washington Memorial. Where the regular floors smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, Suite 6 smelled of leather furniture polish and expensive cologne. Where standard patient rooms had thin curtains and beeping monitors that nurses could hear from the hallway, Suite 6 had soundproofed walls, privacy glass that could be frosted with a switch, and monitoring equipment that transmitted directly to a tablet Doris carried on her hip. The suite cost $15,000 per night, not including medical services. Most of that cost was silence. Doris had arrived at 6:30 p.m. for her 12-hour shift, passing through 3 security checkpoints that had nothing to do with hospital protocol. The first was in the executive wing lobby, where a man in a tailored suit had scanned her badge twice and checked her name against a physical list. The second was at the 6th-floor elevator bank, where another man had examined the contents of her nursing bag with the efficiency of someone trained in explosives detection. The third was directly outside Suite 6, where 2 men flanked the door like bookends, their jackets cut to conceal shoulder holsters. They'd nodded at her with the recognition that came from 3 years of her tending to their employer's various associates. She was part of the furniture now, expected, invisible. Inside, the suite was arranged like a luxury hotel room that happened to contain medical equipment. A king-sized hospital bed dominated the space, but it was dressed in high thread count linens that didn't come from hospital supply. A leather sofa and two matching chairs formed a conversation area near the window, which offered a view of the city skyline that probably cost extra. Original artwork, or expensive reproductions, hung on walls painted in warm neutrals instead of institutional beige, and in the bed, looking diminished in a way that seemed fundamentally wrong, was Eric Washington. Doris had seen powerful men made vulnerable by illness before. It was part of the job in the executive wing. But Eric Washington's vulnerability felt different, dangerous somehow, like watching a wolf forced to show its throat. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with salt and pepper hair that was tousled from surgery rather than styled. Even in a hospital gown, even pale from anesthesia, he radiated an authority that made the air feel heavier. His eyes tracked her movement as she approached the bed, and Doris felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. These were eyes accustomed to reading people, to calculating threat levels and loyalty quotients in the space of a glance. She kept her expression professionally neutral, the mask she'd perfected over 3 years. "Mr. Washington, I'm Doris Hall. I'll be your nurse for the night shift." Her voice was steady, competent, forgettable. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone cut me open and rearranged my insides." His voice was rough from intubation but strong, not a man who stayed vulnerable for long. "That's essentially what happened." Doris moved to the monitors, checking vitals with practiced efficiency. "Your gallbladder was severely inflamed. Dr. Reeves performed a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, 4 small incisions instead of 1 large one. You should be back to full strength in 2 weeks." 2 weeks? Eric's jaw tightened. "I don't have 2 weeks. You don't have a gallbladder anymore either, so we're working with what we've got." Doris adjusted the IV drip without looking at him. "Your blood pressure is slightly elevated, which is normal post-surgery. But I need you to stay calm and rest. Doctor's orders." Something flickered in Eric's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or amusement. Men like Eric Washington weren't used to being told what to do by nurses. But pain and anesthesia were great equalizers, and Doris had learned that competence earned respect faster than deference in this world. She was checking his incision sites, noting the minimal drainage and good color, when the door opened. The man who entered moved with the confidence of someone who belonged in this room, in this world, in Eric Washington's inner circle. Mid-50s, silver hair styled with the kind of casual precision that cost $200 per cut, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Doris made in a month. His face had the practiced neutrality of a corporate lawyer or a priest, someone trained to keep secrets. "Eric." The man's voice was smooth, concerned in a way that sounded rehearsed. "Thank God you're awake. I've been worried." Eric's posture shifted slightly, a subtle relaxation that spoke of long familiarity. "Silas, you didn't need to come tonight, I'm fine." "You had emergency surgery, of course I came." Silas moved to the side of the bed, his eyes flicking briefly to Doris before dismissing her as part of the furniture. "How are you feeling?" "Like hell. But I'll survive." "Of course you will." Silas pulled one of the leather chairs closer to the bed, settling into it with the ease of someone who'd sat vigil before. "I hate to bring business to your bedside, but we have a situation." Doris continued her work, adjusting monitors, checking IV lines, performing the dozens of small tasks that made her simultaneously essential and invisible. Her hands moved through muscle memory, while her attention sharpened. The Riverside development. Silas's tone was carefully calibrated, urgent but not alarming. "The investors are getting nervous about the timeline. With you in surgery, they're worried about leadership continuity. I've been managing the situation, but they need reassurance." Eric's eyes narrowed slightly. "What kind of reassurance?" "The standard kind. Paperwork, signatures, legal formalities." Silas reached into the leather portfolio he'd carried in, a gesture so smooth it seemed choreographed. Nothing you haven't signed a dozen times before, just proof that you're still in control, still making the decisions. Doris watched from the corner of her eye as Silas extracted a document, thick with pages, bound with the kind of legal precision that screamed expensive law firm, the kind of document that transferred millions of dollars with a single signature. I know the timing isn't ideal, Silas continued, placing the document on the adjustable bed table with careful reverence. But the deal closes tomorrow morning. If we don't have your authorization tonight, we lose the entire acquisition. $200 million, Eric. 2 years of negotiations. Eric's hand, still trembling slightly from surgery, reached toward the document. The tremor was normal. Doris had seen it 1,000 times in post-surgical patients. Muscle weakness, residual anesthesia, the body's protest against having been violated by scalpels and manipulated under bright lights. But something in Silas's posture made her pause. Something in the way he'd placed the document, angled just so, positioned for a signature without review. Something her father would have noticed immediately. Doris's pulse quickened as Silas produced a Mont Blanc pen, uncapping it with a soft click that seemed too loud in the quiet room. "Just your signature, Eric," Silas said softly. "Then you can rest." Doris's training had taught her that the human hand was a terrible liar. A post-surgical tremor followed predictable patterns, intermittent, worse with extension, improving with rest. She'd been monitoring Eric's hand movements since she'd entered the suite, cataloging the shake in his fingers when he'd gestured during their initial conversation, the way his grip had faltered slightly when he'd reached for the water cup on his bedside table. It was her job to notice these things. Tremors could indicate nerve damage, medication side effects, or complications that required immediate intervention. So when Eric reached for the pen Silas offered, Doris's eyes tracked the movement with clinical precision. The tremor was there, visible in the slight oscillation of his fingers as they closed around the Mont Blanc. Normal, expected, nothing concerning. But as Eric's hand moved toward the document, Doris's angle of view shifted, and she saw the signature line at the bottom of page 7. Her breath stopped. The signature was already there. Eric Washington's name, written in the distinctive hand she'd studied 5 years ago during the federal bid-rigging investigation. Every loop perfect, every flourish exact, the kind of signature that would pass any casual inspection, that would satisfy lawyers and witnesses and notaries who'd seen Eric sign documents 100 times before. Except Doris Hall didn't do casual inspections. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, as clear as if Theodore Hall were standing beside her. "The eye sees the shape, Piccola, but the paper remembers the pressure. Always check the pressure." She moved closer to the bed, adjusting the IV stand in a motion that looked like routine nursing but brought her within 2 feet of the document. Her eyes locked onto the signature, and 3 years of forced invisibility fell away like shed skin. She wasn't a nurse anymore. She was her father's daughter, trained from childhood to see what others missed. The signature's shape was flawless. The letter formation was exact. The spacing matched Eric's known exemplars perfectly. Someone had studied his handwriting extensively, had practiced the loops and curves until they could reproduce them in their sleep. But the ink told a different story. In an authentic signature, pressure varied based on muscle movement and writing speed. The initial letter typically showed heavier pressure, the hand pressing down as it began the motion. The middle section often lightened as the hand gained momentum, the pen skating across paper with practiced ease. Then came the final flourish, where the writer typically pressed down again, emphasizing the conclusion with unconscious authority. Eric Washington's authentic signature showed this pattern clearly. Doris had memorized it during the federal investigation, had spent hours examining photocopies and original documents. The capital E was always heavy, almost engraved into the paper. The rick that followed was lighter, faster. Then came a slight pause, barely perceptible, before Washington, which showed medium pressure until the final upward stroke that was his signature flourish, pressed hard enough to sometimes indent the paper beneath. The signature on this document showed none of that variation. The ink was uniform throughout, displaying the kind of consistent pressure that came from mechanical reproduction or a forger working slowly, carefully, without the natural rhythm of authentic handwriting. It was too perfect, too controlled. Each letter showed identical ink saturation, identical line width, identical pressure distribution. It was the work of someone who understood that signatures were visual patterns, but didn't understand that they were also physical performances. Someone who'd used a high-resolution scan and a pressure-sensitive stylus, or perhaps a skilled hand working from exemplars with mechanical precision. Either way, it wasn't Eric's signature. Doris felt her heart hammering against her ribs. The implications cascaded through her mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't a routine document. This was a pre-signed authorization, placed before Eric for a second signature that would validate the first. The forged signature would establish his consent, and his second signature, the one Silas was urging him to add right now, would make it legally binding. $200 million in asset transfers, legitimized by one authentic signature paired with one perfect forgery. And the only person who could see the forgery was the invisible nurse standing 3 feet away. The woman who wasn't supposed to know anything about handwriting analysis, who wasn't supposed to notice anything beyond blood pressure readings and IV drips. Eric's hand hovered over the document. The pen touched paper. "Just sign at the bottom, Eric," Silas said, his voice smooth as expensive whiskey. "Right below your existing signature. The lawyers need both, your authorization and your confirmation." Doris watched the pen begin to move. She saw Silas's expression, carefully neutral, but with something underneath. Anticipation, maybe, or hunger. She saw the 2 security guards outside the door, visible through the privacy glass. She saw the monitoring equipment, the leather furniture, the expensive artwork on the walls. She saw the entire architecture of power that said speaking up would be suicide. And she saw her father's magnifying glass in her nursing bag, wrapped in soft cloth, carried for 3 years without purpose. Until now. The math was brutally simple. She had $40,000 left to pay on Marcus's debt. 4 more months of keeping her head down and staying invisible. 4 more months until she could walk away from this world and never look back. Speaking up meant losing everything: the job, the money, possibly her life. If Silas was willing to forge $200 million in documents, what would he do to protect that investment? But her father's other lesson burned through the calculation like acid through paper. The word on the paper is a man's soul. When someone forges a signature, they're stealing identity, and we don't stay silent when we witness theft. Eric's pen pressed down, beginning the E of his name. Doris's hand moved before her mind finished deciding. She stepped forward, her fingers closing around Eric's wrist with the firm professional grip of a nurse preventing a patient from making a dangerous move. "Mr. Washington, stop." Her voice came out steady, clinical, the tone she used when a patient was about to pull out their IV or stand up too quickly. "Don't sign this document." The room froze. Eric's eyes snapped to her face. Silas's expression went from smooth confidence to sharp confusion in the space of a heartbeat. The guards outside turned toward the door. "Excuse me?" Silas's voice had ice underneath the politeness. "Nurse, this is a private business matter. Please continue with your duties." But Doris was looking at Eric, seeing the sharpness return to his eyes despite the anesthesia fog. She'd learned in 3 years that men like Eric Washington didn't survive by ignoring warnings, even from unexpected sources. She released his wrist and pointed to the signature at the bottom of page 7. "That signature," she said quietly, "is a forgery." The silence that followed was absolute. Then Silas laughed, a smooth, dismissive sound that would have made her doubt herself if she hadn't spent her entire childhood learning to trust what paper remembered. That's absurd. I watched Mr. Washington sign. No, Doris interrupted, her eyes still locked on Eric's. You didn't. Someone else did. Someone who copied his signature almost perfectly. But not quite. The moment stretched like pulled glass, beautiful and about to shatter. Doris heard three voices in her head, each one demanding something different. The first was pure survival instinct, the voice that had kept her alive through 3 years of high-risk nursing. Stay silent. Stay invisible. 4 more months and you're free. The second was her brother's voice, younger and frightened. Doris, they know where I live. Please, I need you. But the third voice drowned out both of them. Her father's voice, rough with emotion, speaking the words he'd said the night before he died. The word on the paper is a man's soul, Piccola. When you see a lie written down, you're witnessing theft of identity. We don't stay silent, not ever. That's what separates us from the forgers. And beneath that, older and deeper, came Nonna Lucia's Sicilian wisdom. La verità è sacra. The truth is sacred, especially when speaking it costs you everything. Eric's pen moved across the paper, the Mont Blanc's nib leaving a trail of blue-black ink that would seal a $200 million fraud. Doris's hand shot out. Her fingers closed around Eric's wrist with the firm, professional grip she'd used 1,000 times to prevent patients from pulling out IVs or touching surgical sites. The pressure was controlled but absolute, a nurse's authority over a patient's body, medical necessity overriding all other considerations. Eric's hand stopped mid-stroke. His eyes snapped to her face, and even through the anesthesia fog, they were sharp as broken glass. Mr. Washington, her voice came out steady, clinical. Don't sign this document. The room went silent in the way that only happens when violence becomes possible. Doris felt the air pressure change as the security guards outside the door moved. She saw Silas's face transform from smooth confidence to something harder, more dangerous. Nurse Hall. Silas's voice was ice wrapped in silk. You're overstepping. Please return to your duties. But Doris wasn't looking at Silas. She was looking at Eric Washington, seeing the calculation happening behind his eyes. Men like Eric didn't survive by ignoring warnings, even from unexpected sources. Especially from unexpected sources. She released his wrist and pointed to the signature at the bottom of page 7, her hand perfectly steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Then she heard Nonna Lucia's voice again, clear as cathedral bells. In Sicilia, we speak the old language when we speak the deepest truth. The ancient words carry weight. They cannot be dismissed. Doris took a breath and felt 3 years of invisibility shatter. Non firmare. The Sicilian words came out in her grandmother's exact cadence, the dialect of Palermo's old quarter, the language of blood and oaths. Questa firma è falsa. Don't sign. This signature is fake. The effect was instantaneous and profound. Eric Washington's entire body went rigid. His eyes widened, and something passed across his face. Shock, recognition, and a deep, ancestral alertness that transcended conscious thought. Because Sicilian wasn't just a language, it was a password, a declaration that the speaker understood codes older than law, bonds deeper than business. Speaking Sicilian in this context wasn't just delivering information, it was invoking the ancient rules of familia, the ones that said truth spoken in the mother tongue was sacred and could not be ignored. Cosa? Eric's response came in the same dialect, his voice suddenly sharp. All traces of post-surgical weakness vanished. Cise? What? Who are you? Silas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Eric, this is absurd. This nurse is obviously confused. She doesn't understand. Silencio. Eric's command was quiet, but absolute. He never took his eyes off Doris's face. Parla, infermiera. Dimmi cosa vedi. Silence. Speak, nurse. Tell me what you see. Doris felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders like her grandmother's hands. She pointed to the signature, switching to English but keeping her voice low, respectful, the tone of someone delivering devastating news to family. That signature, the one already on the page, it's a forgery. A very good one, but not authentic. The pressure variation is wrong. Too uniform, mechanical. Someone copied your signature almost perfectly, but they couldn't replicate the physical performance of your hand. The way you press down on the initial capital, lighter through the middle, heavy on the final stroke. This signature shows constant pressure throughout. It's been placed there to make you think you've already authorized this document, so your second signature will legitimize the fraud. The silence that followed was absolute. Doris could hear the monitors beeping, could hear the rain against the window, could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Eric's hand moved to the document, not to sign but to examine. His fingers traced over the signature, and even weakened by surgery, he understood what she was saying. She could see it in his face, the recognition, the rage building beneath the surface. Silas. Eric's voice was calm, which made it more terrifying. Where did this document come from? Eric, I don't know what this woman is talking about. That's your signature. I watched you. Bugiardo. The Sicilian word for liar came out like a knife. Eric's eyes never left the document. Dimmi ancora, infermiera. Come lo sai? Tell me again, nurse. How do you know? Doris straightened her spine, feeling her father's training and her grandmother's courage flowing through her like an inheritance finally claimed. Because before I was a nurse, she said quietly, I was a forensic document examiner. I specialized in signature analysis and forgery detection. I worked on federal fraud cases. And 5 years ago, I studied your signature as part of a construction bid rigging investigation. I know your handwriting, Mr. Washington. Every pressure point, every variation, every microscopic detail. She paused. That signature on the page isn't yours. Eric's eyes locked onto hers, and Doris saw the exact moment he made his decision. He reached for the call button beside his bed. Not the nurse call, but the other one, the unmarked button that summoned different kinds of help. The door opened immediately. The security guards entered, no longer passive observers. Arrestalo, Eric said softly, gesturing to Silas. And someone get me my lawyers. The real ones. The security guards had Silas by both arms within seconds, professional and implacable. His expensive suit wrinkled under their grip, and for the first time since entering the room, his carefully constructed mask cracked. Panic flashed across his face before he forced it back into indignant outrage. Eric, this is insane. You're listening to a nurse over me? 20 years of loyalty, and you believe? Zito. Eric's command was soft but final. Quiet. He turned to Doris, his eyes sharp despite the pallor of surgery. You said you specialized in forgery detection. Prove it. Show me exactly what you see. Doris felt her training click into place like a key in a lock. This was the part she knew, the part her father had drilled into her until it became instinct. She moved to the bedside table and carefully extracted her nursing bag, aware of every eye in the room tracking her movements. From the bottom, wrapped in soft cloth, she pulled out her father's magnifying glass. The sight of it seemed to shift something in Eric's expression. Recognition, perhaps, that this wasn't improvisation, but expertise. May I? She gestured to the document. Eric nodded, his hand moving it closer to her. Doris positioned the magnifying glass over the signature, adjusting the articulated arm until the signature filled the lens at 10 times magnification. A signature is both visual and physical, she began, her voice steady and professional. Most people only see the visual component, the shape of the letters, the general appearance. But a forensic examiner looks at the physical performance, how the hand moved, where it pressed down, where it lifted, where it paused. She pointed to the capital E that began Eric's name. Your authentic signature starts with heavy downward pressure here. The pen digs into the paper slightly. It's unconscious. Your hand naturally presses down as it begins the motion, establishing control. But look at this E under magnification. Eric leaned forward, wincing slightly from the surgical incisions, but focused completely on what she was showing him. The ink saturation is uniform. No variation in line width, no micro indentation in the paper. That's impossible with natural handwriting. When you press down, the paper compresses. When you lighten up, it recovers. This signature shows no compression patterns at all. She moved the magnifying glass along the signature, tracking each letter. Here, in the middle section, Rick Washington, your natural signature speeds up. The hand gains momentum, the pen moves faster, the pressure lightens. It's fluid. But this signature maintains identical pressure throughout. Every letter has the same ink density, the same line thickness. That's mechanical consistency, not human performance. Silas made a sound, half laugh, half protest. This is ridiculous. You're inventing details to— The pen lift, Doris interrupted, not looking away from the document. That's what always exposes digital forgeries. When you sign your name naturally, Mr. Washington, you lift the pen 3 times. Once after the initial E, once between Eric and Washington, and once at the end of the signature for the final flourish. Those pen lifts create microscopic gaps where the ink flow stops and restarts. Under magnification, you can see tiny ink pooling where the pen touches down again. She adjusted the magnifying glass to show a connection point. This signature has no pen lifts. The entire thing is one continuous line, which means it was created digitally and printed with a high-resolution inkjet printer using specialty ink that mimics ballpoint. The forger probably scanned multiple authentic signatures, created a composite digital version, and printed it directly onto this document. It's sophisticated, expensive, and almost perfect. Almost, Eric repeated, his voice cold as winter stone. Almost, Doris confirmed, because the forger couldn't replicate the physical pressure variations that make your signature uniquely yours. They copied the shape perfectly but couldn't copy the soul of the handwriting. She pulled back the magnifying glass and met Eric's eyes. There's one more thing, the paper memory. Explain. Doris turned the document slightly, angling it under the suite's overhead light. When you sign with a pen, the pressure creates an impression in the paper fibers. It's invisible to the naked eye in most cases, but you can see it with raking light at a low angle across the surface. She demonstrated, tilting the document until shadows appeared in relief. Look at the signature's impression depth. It's completely flat. No dimensionality. A printed signature has no physical depth because no actual pen pressure was applied. Compare that to the other signatures on this document, the witness signatures here and here. See the slight depression in the paper? That's authentic ballpoint pen pressure. Eric studied the document in silence, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty and barely controlled rage. How long? He looked at Silas, who was still held between the 2 guards. How long have you been planning this? Silas's face had gone from red to white. Eric, I can explain. The truth. Now. Or I let these men handle it their way. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Silas's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him in a visible collapse. 6 months, he said quietly. Since you started talking about going legitimate. About moving away from the old business. I've spent 20 years building connections in the old world, Eric. Going legitimate would have made me irrelevant. The Riverside development was supposed to be my exit. Transfer the assets to offshore holdings, liquidate everything, and disappear before you realized what happened. Who else? Eric's voice was deadly calm. Patterson and Chen from the legal team. DeMarco from accounting. We needed access to verify the document formatting, the corporate seals. Eric picked up his phone from the bedside table, never taking his eyes off Silas. He dialed a number from memory. When someone answered, he spoke in rapid Sicilian, too fast and colloquial for Doris to follow completely, but she caught the essential words: names, addresses, instructions. When he hung up, he looked at the security guards. Take him to the warehouse on Pier 47. Keep him there until my people arrive. And call Marchetti. Tell him I need a new legal team by morning. One that hasn't been bought. The guards hauled Silas toward the door. He was pleading now, the smooth consigliere replaced by a desperate man who'd just watched his perfect plan unravel because of ink pressure and paper memory. The door closed behind them, and the suite fell silent except for the steady beeping of monitors. Eric turned to Doris, studying her with the intensity of someone reassessing everything they thought they knew. Doris Hall, he said quietly, forensic document examiner turned nurse, speaking perfect Sicilian, carrying her father's tools, risking her life to stop a signature. Yes, sir. Why? The question was simple, but vast. Why risk everything? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Doris thought of her father at his desk, of Nonna Lucia's weathered hands, of 3 years spent invisible and silent. Because, she said softly, the truth is sacred, and silence in the face of theft makes you complicit. My father taught me that. Eric was quiet for a long moment. Then he pressed the call button again, summoning different help. We need to talk, he said, about your future. The man who arrived 30 minutes later wasn't a lawyer. He was something more dangerous, the kind of person who moved through the world with absolute authority and no visible title. Silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most cars, carrying a leather briefcase that looked deceptively simple. Marchetti, Eric said by way of introduction. My actual consigliere, the one who doesn't forge signatures. Marchetti's eyes flicked to Doris with the assessing gaze of someone who evaluated threats and assets with equal efficiency. The nurse who speaks Sicilian and reads forgeries. Forensic document examiner, Eric corrected. Doris Hall. She just saved me $200 million and probably my life. Then we owe her a debt. Marchetti set his briefcase on the leather sofa and opened it with practiced precision. What do you need, boss? Everything on Nurse Hall. Background, family, financials, debts, parking tickets. I want to know why a forensic expert is working night shifts in a hospital. Eric's eyes never left Doris's face. And I want it in the next 10 minutes. Doris felt her stomach drop. This was the moment where invisibility shattered completely, where every carefully constructed wall came down. She could run, make an excuse, leave the suite, disappear into the city like she'd disappeared from her old life 3 years ago. But her father's voice whispered again, truth is sacred. And she'd already chosen truth when she'd spoken those 4 words in Sicilian. You don't need to investigate, she said quietly. I'll tell you. Eric raised an eyebrow. Go on. So Doris told him. About Marcus, brilliant and reckless. About the predatory loans that had spiraled from medical school debt into $180,000 of suffocating pressure. About the collectors who knew where her brother lived, who'd made the kind of threats that weren't idle. About her choice to abandon a career she'd loved because forensic examiners made $95,000 a year, and nurses in the executive wing made that in 4 months. I've paid down $140,000 in 3 years, she finished. I have $40,000 left. 4 more months, and I'm done. My brother graduates medical school next year, debt-free. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm invisible. The suite was silent except for the rain against the windows. Marchetti had stopped pretending to work on his laptop and was watching Eric's face with the attention of someone who'd learned to read his employer's moods like weather patterns. Eric was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up his phone again. Marchetti, transfer $180,000 to... He looked at Doris. Who holds the debt? Doris's throat went dry. I don't understand. The collectors. Who are they? Give me names. Empire Financial Services. But Mr. Washington, I can't. You can, and you will. Eric's voice wasn't harsh, just absolute. Marchetti, find Empire Financial Services. Pay the full outstanding balance of Doris Hall's brother's debt. Add another $100,000 as a gift for the inconvenience they've caused. Wire transfer immediate with documentation showing the debt is satisfied in full. Eric, Marchetti's voice carried a note of warning. You're medicated. Maybe we should discuss. I'm not medicated enough to forget what just happened. She saved my empire, Marchetti. She risked her life. She spoke truth when everyone else was selling me lies. Eric's eyes locked on Doris again, and she saw something in them that made her chest tighten. Respect, recognition, and something deeper. Pay the debt. Now. Marchetti worked in silence, his fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. Less than 5 minutes later, he looked up. Done. Empire Financial Services has confirmed receipt and sent discharge documentation. The debt no longer exists. Doris couldn't breathe. 3 years of crushing weight, of 12-hour shifts and calculated invisibility, of watching every dollar and calculating every risk, gone in 5 minutes because she told the truth about ink pressure. I don't... Her voice cracked. I can't accept... You already have. Eric shifted in the hospital bed, wincing but determined. And we're not done. Marchetti, draw up an employment contract. Chief of Operations and Strategic Analyst. Base salary $500,000 annually, with performance bonuses. Full benefits. Signing bonus of $250,000. Effective immediately. Eric, that's excessive, Marchetti began. That's appropriate for someone who can spot microscopic forgeries and speak the old language. Someone who knows when to stay silent and when to risk everything by speaking up. Someone who understands both forensic precision and street-level survival. Eric's voice softened slightly. Someone I can actually trust. Doris felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back. Mr. Washington, I'm a nurse. I don't know anything about running operations or strategic analysis for... She gestured vaguely at the suite, the security, the world he represented. You know how to read documents better than any lawyer I've employed. You know how to spot deception. You understand pressure, not just in signatures, but in situations. You've spent 3 years navigating a world where one wrong move meant death or financial ruin. And you never made that wrong move until tonight when you made the only right move possible. Eric leaned forward. I'm going legitimate, Doris. Moving everything into lawful business. Real estate development, construction, venture capital. I need someone who can examine every document, every contract, every signature with the kind of precision you just demonstrated. Someone who'll tell me the truth even when it costs them everything. Why me? The question escaped before she could stop it. You could hire anyone. Experts, consultants. I just had 20 years of experts and consultants try to steal $200 million from my hospital bed. The only person who stopped them was a nurse carrying her dead father's magnifying glass and her grandmother's language. Eric's smile was slight but genuine. In my world, loyalty like that doesn't come from salary negotiations or corporate contracts. It comes from character, and you just showed me yours. Marchetti was already typing, the employment contract materializing with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Within minutes, he turned the laptop toward Doris, and she saw her name at the top of a document that promised more money than she'd imagined earning in a decade. Read it carefully, Eric said. Use that forensic training. Make sure every word is what it should be. No forgeries in my contracts. Despite everything, the shock, the surreality, the complete upending of her carefully constructed plans, Doris almost laughed. She read through the contract with the same attention she'd given to the forged signature, checking every clause, every term, every commitment. It was legitimate, generous beyond reason, but legitimate. She looked up at Eric Washington, the man she'd saved, the man who'd just dismantled 3 years of her life structure and rebuilt it into something unrecognizable and terrifying and full of possibility. "If I sign this," she said quietly, "I stop being invisible." "Yes," Eric agreed. "You become indispensable instead. Is that acceptable?" Doris thought of her father at his desk, examining signatures until his heart gave out. She thought of Nonna Lucia, who'd crossed an ocean carrying only language and suspicion. She thought of Marcus, who could now become a doctor without looking over his shoulder. She picked up the Mont Blanc pen that had nearly signed away Eric's empire and added her signature to the contract. Her hand pressed down firmly on the initial D, lightened through the middle, and finished with her own distinctive flourish. Authentic. Unmistakable. Hers. Doris's first official act as chief of operations was to finish her nursing shift. Eric had protested naturally. Marchetti had looked at her like she'd grown a second head. But Doris had been firm in a way that surprised even herself. "You hired me because I tell you the truth and finish what I start," she'd said. "I'm contracted for 12 hours. I'm giving you 12 hours. Besides, you're still recovering from surgery, and right now you need a nurse more than you need a strategic analyst." Eric had studied her for a long moment, then nodded with something that might have been approval. "Fair enough, but tomorrow you move into the office next to Marchetti's, and you never touch a bedpan again. Deal." So Doris had continued her rounds, checking vitals, adjusting IV medications, monitoring post-operative recovery, while her mind spun with the impossible reality that she was now Eric Washington's chief of operations, with a signing bonus that had just hit her bank account like a financial asteroid. She'd texted Marcus from the bathroom, keeping it simple: "Debt paid. You're free. Call you tomorrow." His response had been a string of question marks and expletives that made her smile despite everything. It was close to midnight when Doris began her final documentation review, a routine she'd perfected over 3 years of meticulous nursing. She pulled up Eric's electronic medical chart on the tablet, scrolling through the surgery notes, post-operative orders, medication schedules, and nursing assessments. Everything looked standard. Dr. Reeves's surgical notes were thorough. The anesthesia records were clean. The post-op orders followed protocol for laparoscopic cholecystectomy, pain management, antibiotics, gradual diet advancement, mobilization schedule. Then Doris reached the medication administration record. And something made her pause. The entry had been added at 9:47 p.m., logged by someone named Chen R.R.N. A supplemental order for heparin, 5,000 units subcutaneous, every 12 hours for DVT prophylaxis, deep vein thrombosis prevention, standard for post-surgical patients who'd be immobilized. Except Eric wasn't immobilized. He was already ambulatory, had walked to the bathroom twice during her shift, and Dr. Reeves's original orders specifically noted early mobilization, no chemical DVT prophylaxis required. Doris felt ice slide down her spine. She cross-referenced the nursing schedule. Chen R. wasn't listed as Eric's assigned nurse tonight. Doris was. Chen wasn't even scheduled to work the executive wing this week. She checked the medication dispensary logs. Someone using Chen's credentials had withdrawn heparin from the automated system at 9:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the chart entry. But Chen's badge hadn't accessed the 6th floor at all tonight. Someone else was using her login. Doris's nursing training collided with her forensic instincts, and suddenly she was seeing a different kind of forgery. Not a signature this time, but a medical order designed to look routine while being catastrophically dangerous. Heparin was a blood thinner. At therapeutic doses in appropriate patients, it prevented dangerous clots. But Eric was already on aspirin for cardiac protection, a mild anticoagulant. Adding heparin created a bleeding risk. And if someone increased the dose slightly, or administered it at the wrong intervals, or combined it with his other medications, a postoperative bleed could be fatal. It would look like a surgical complication, a tragic outcome from an emergency procedure. No one would question it, except someone had underestimated the obsessive documentation habits of a nurse who'd spent 3 years staying invisible by being perfect. Doris pulled up the digital signature on the heparin order. It was supposedly authorized by Dr. Reeves at 9:45 p.m. But she'd seen Dr. Reeves leave the hospital at 8:30 p.m., exhausted after a long surgery. She'd watched him through the window, getting into his car in the parking garage. She zoomed in on the authorization timestamp, 9:45:17 p.m. Then she checked Dr. Reeves's badge access logs in the security system, a trick she'd learned from watching the executive wing's paranoid security protocols. Dr. Isam Reeves's badge had last accessed the building at 8:34 p.m., exiting through the main entrance. He hadn't returned. Someone had entered a medical order using Dr. Reeves's stolen credentials, forging a digital signature that would authorize a medication that could kill Eric Washington within hours. Doris's hands were shaking now, but her mind was crystalline clear. She thought about Silas's confession, Patterson and Chen from the legal team, DeMarco from accounting. Chen from the legal team, not Chen R., the nurse. But someone with access to the hospital's computer systems could steal any credentials they wanted. This was the backup plan. If the $200 million fraud failed, they'd eliminate Eric permanently, make it look medical, untraceable. She grabbed her tablet and moved quickly to Eric's bedside. He was dozing, the exhaustion of surgery and stress finally catching up. Marchetti was still there, working on his laptop in one of the leather chairs, looking like he hadn't slept in days. "Marchetti," Doris said quietly but urgently, "wake Eric, now." Marchetti's head snapped up, and he read her expression with the instinct of someone who'd survived decades in dangerous business. He moved to the bed, touching Eric's shoulder. "Boss, we have a problem." Eric's eyes opened, instantly alert despite the pain medication. "What?" Doris held up the tablet, showing him the medication order. "Someone just added heparin to your chart. It's designed to look like routine DVT prophylaxis, but you don't need it. You're already mobile, and you're on aspirin. The combination creates a bleeding risk that could be fatal post-surgery." She pulled up the security logs. The order was entered using Dr. Reeves's credentials at 9:45 p.m., but Dr. Reeves left the building at 8:34 p.m. and hasn't come back. Someone's using stolen credentials to forge medical orders. Eric sat up despite the surgical pain, his face hardening into something dangerous. "Chen." "From your legal team," Doris confirmed. "Silas named him. He must have access to the hospital's IT systems through your ownership. He's trying to finish what the forgery started." Marchetti was already on his phone, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences. "Security is pulling Chen's access logs now. If he's in the building..." "He might have already dosed the medication," Doris interrupted. "The dispensary log shows heparin withdrawn at 9:52 p.m. using Chen R's stolen nursing credentials. Someone has a syringe right now. And if they can get past your security..." The door handle turned. Everyone in the room froze. A man in scrubs entered, carrying a medication tray, his badge reading Chen R. RN. His face was unfamiliar. Not the Chen from the legal team, but someone hired, expendable, paid to administer a lethal injection and disappear. He stopped when he saw 3 people staring at him. His hand moved toward the syringe on his tray. Marchetti moved faster. The gun appeared from beneath his suit jacket with practiced efficiency, aimed with absolute steadiness. "Put the tray down," Marchetti said calmly. "Step away from it. Hands where I can see them." The man's face went through several calculations: fight, flight, denial, before settling on resignation. He placed the tray on the floor and raised his hands. Eric's security guards entered behind him, summoned by Marchetti's call. They secured the fake nurse with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. Marchetti picked up the syringe from the tray, examining it. "Heparin, probably triple the therapeutic dose." Eric looked at Doris, and in his eyes she saw something that went beyond gratitude or respect. "Twice in one night, you've saved my life." "Just doing my job," Doris said, though her hands were still trembling with adrenaline. Both of them. Chief of Operations and Guardian Angel. Eric's smile was slight, but genuine. I'm starting to think $500,000 isn't enough. The fake nurse was gone within minutes, hauled away by Eric's security with the kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't their first extraction. Marchetti had the heparin syringe bagged as evidence, already making calls to trace who'd hired the man and how deep Chen's network ran through Eric's organization. But Doris wasn't finished. We need to audit every medical entry in your chart from the past 12 hours, she said, her tablet already open, scrolling through the electronic records with the focused intensity of someone hunting for more hidden threats. If Chen compromised the medication system once, he might have planted other orders, delayed doses, wrong medications, contraindicated combinations. Eric watched her work, still sitting upright in the hospital bed despite the surgical pain etched in the lines around his eyes. Most people would be shaking right now, processing what just happened. I'll process later. Doris's fingers moved across the screen, cross-referencing every order against Dr. Reeves's original surgical protocol. Right now, I need to make sure you survive the night. Marchetti glanced up from his phone, something approaching approval in his expression. She's methodical. I like that. She's essential, Eric corrected quietly. There's a difference. Doris found 2 more irregularities in the next 10 minutes. A duplicate order for Dilaudid that would have resulted in respiratory depression when combined with Eric's existing pain medication. A discontinuation order for his antibiotic that had been entered and then deleted, creating a gap in his infection prevention that could have led to sepsis. Chen was thorough, she said, showing Eric the timestamps. He created multiple failure points. Any one of them could have been fatal, and they'd all look like medical errors or surgical complications. No one would have suspected assassination. But you suspected. Eric's voice was soft, almost wondering. You caught every single trap. I know how to read patterns, whether it's ink on paper or data in a chart. Doris looked up from the tablet, meeting his eyes. And I know when something doesn't fit the pattern. That's what you hired me for. I hired you because you risked your life to tell me the truth about a signature. Everything else is just confirmation that my instincts were right. Marchetti cleared his throat. Boss, we've secured Chen. He was attempting to leave the country, had a ticket to the Caymans under a false identity. We're also picking up DeMarco and Patterson. The entire conspiracy is being rolled up as we speak. Good. Eric didn't look away from Doris. What's the damage assessment? Silas siphoned approximately $12 million over the past 6 months through various shell companies and inflated invoices, Marchetti reported. The $200 million transfer was supposed to be the final score, but the preliminary theft had been ongoing. We'll recover most of it. The legal team he corrupted will be replaced by morning. Your legitimate business interests are secure. Because of her, Eric gestured to Doris. If she hadn't stopped that signature, I'd have lost everything. If she hadn't caught the medical sabotage, I'd be dead. 2 separate attempts on my life and my empire, both stopped by the same person. The weight of his words settled over the room like snow. Doris felt her heart rate accelerate, felt the enormity of what had happened in the past 6 hours, finally breaking through her professional composure. Her voice wavered slightly. I did what anyone would have done. No. Eric's contradiction was gentle but absolute. Most people would have stayed silent, would have decided it wasn't their problem, wasn't worth the risk. You had $40,000 left to pay, and 4 months until freedom, and you threw it all away the moment you saw a forged signature. That's not what anyone would do. That's what someone with honor does. Doris felt something crack in her chest. 3 years of controlled invisibility, finally giving way to the overwhelming reality of being seen. My father always said that silence in the face of theft makes you complicit. Your father raised someone extraordinary. Eric shifted in the bed, wincing but determined. Marchetti, give us the room. Marchetti's eyebrows rose slightly, but he gathered his laptop and left without argument, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The suite fell quiet except for the monitors and the rain that had finally stopped, leaving the city glittering and clean outside the windows. Doris. Eric's voice was different now, stripped of the commanding authority, more vulnerable. I need you to understand something. I've spent 25 years building an empire on calculated risk and measured trust. I've had advisors, lawyers, enforcers, people who swore loyalty and meant it most of the time. But I've never had someone who'd risk everything, their job, their safety, their life, to protect me from my own blind spots. You barely know me, Doris said softly. 24 hours ago, I was just the night nurse. 24 hours ago, I thought I knew who I could trust. Silas was my right hand for 2 decades. I would have bet my life on his loyalty. Eric's smile was bitter. Turns out I nearly did. The only person who actually saved my life was the invisible woman carrying her father's magnifying glass. He reached for her hand, and Doris let him take it, feeling the tremor that was still there, the post-surgical weakness that made him human despite the power he wielded. I'm going legitimate, he said. Really legitimate this time. No more gray areas, no more old-world connections that blur into criminal territory. I want to build something clean, something that won't require my children to choose between family loyalty and the law. He paused. But I can't do that alone. I need someone who can examine every contract, every signature, every business decision with absolute precision. Someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, who'll stop me from making catastrophic mistakes. You need an analyst, Doris said. You already hired one. I need a partner. Eric's grip on her hand tightened slightly. Someone I can trust completely, in business, in strategy, in everything. The word hung between them, vast and terrifying and full of implications that went far beyond employment contracts and strategic analysis. Doris thought about her father, who'd spent his life examining signatures and died at his desk still looking for truth in ink. She thought about Nonna Lucia, who'd taught her that the old language carried weight because it couldn't lie. She thought about 3 years of invisibility and the moment she'd chosen to speak. I stopped being invisible tonight, she said quietly. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else yet. Then learn with me. Eric's voice was rough with emotion and exhaustion and something deeper. Learn how to be indispensable, irreplaceable, essential. Learn how to be seen. Because I'm looking at you right now, Doris Hall, and I've never seen anyone more clearly. Outside, the city stretched toward morning, and inside Suite 6, something shifted that had nothing to do with medical charts or forged signatures. Something that felt like the beginning of a story neither of them had planned but both of them needed. Doris squeezed his hand once, gently, mindful of the IV line and the surgical recovery still ahead. Okay, she said. We'll learn together. 3 months later, Doris Hall stood in the penthouse conference room of Washington Enterprises, looking out over the city that had once swallowed her whole. The view from the 42nd floor was staggering. Manhattan stretched in every direction, glittering with afternoon sun and infinite possibility. Behind her, the conference table was covered with contracts, architectural plans, and feasibility studies for Eric's new venture. Legitimate real estate development focused on affordable housing and community revitalization. Every document had passed through her forensic examination. Every signature had been verified. Every business partner had been vetted with the kind of scrutiny that came from nearly losing $200 million to a trusted advisor. You're doing it again, Eric's voice came from the doorway, warm with amusement. Doris turned, unable to suppress her smile. He looked nothing like the weakened man in the hospital bed 3 months ago. The surgical recovery was complete, and he'd transformed along with his business, less of the commanding mafia boss, more of the visionary entrepreneur. Still sharp, still formidable, but focused on building rather than controlling. Doing what? That thing where you stare at the city like you're trying to memorize it. He crossed the room to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Still not used to being 42 floors up? Still not used to being visible, she admitted. Sometimes I walk into a room and expect people to look through me like they did at the hospital. Then I remember I'm your chief of operations. And everyone's staring because they're waiting for me to tell them what to do. And you do it brilliantly. Eric's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing with the ease of habit. 3 months, and they'd built something that went far beyond professional partnership. Something neither of them had planned but both had chosen deliberately, carefully, with the same attention to detail they brought to every contract. Marcus called this morning, Doris said. He got his residency placement, Johns Hopkins, emergency medicine, first in his class. He should be. His sister paid for his education with 3 years of invisible martyrdom. Eric squeezed her hand. You saved his future before you saved mine. I saved yours twice in one night. I think that makes us even. We'll never be even. You gave me something more valuable than my life or my empire. His voice softened. You gave me a reason to actually deserve both. Doris turned to face him fully, seeing the truth of it in his eyes. The past 3 months had been transformative, not just for her, but for everything Eric had built. They'd systematically dismantled the gray areas of his business, severed the old world connections, moved every asset into legitimate enterprises. It had been brutal, costly, and absolutely necessary. The board meeting is in 20 minutes, she said. Are you ready? To announce the final phase of our restructuring, to confirm that Washington Enterprises is now completely legitimate, audited by federal regulators, and committed to ethical business practices? Eric's smile was slight but genuine. I'm ready. The question is whether they're ready for what comes next. Doris knew what he meant. The announcement they'd prepared together, the one that would reshape not just his company, but their future. She'd written the press release herself, examined every word with forensic precision. The board members began arriving, new faces, legitimate business people who'd replaced the compromised advisors. Marchetti was there, having transitioned from consigliere to chief legal officer with the same efficiency he brought to everything. He nodded at Doris with the respect of someone who'd watched her prove herself repeatedly over 3 months of intensive corporate restructuring. When everyone was seated, Eric stood at the head of the table and Doris stood beside him. Not behind, not in the shadows, but beside. Equal, visible, essential. Thank you all for coming, Eric began. 3 months ago, this company nearly collapsed due to internal corruption and my own failure to see betrayal from within. We survived because of one person's courage, expertise, and unwillingness to stay silent in the face of fraud. His eyes found Doris, and she felt the weight of every gaze in the room following. Doris Hall saved my life twice in one night. She's since saved this company approximately 24 times through her forensic analysis of our contracts, her strategic restructuring of our operations, and her absolute insistence on ethical practices in every aspect of our business. Today, I'm announcing that she will no longer serve as Chief of Operations. Doris saw confusion ripple through the board members. This wasn't in the prepared agenda. Instead, Eric continued, his voice strong and certain, Doris Hall is being promoted to co-CEO of Washington Enterprises. Equal authority, equal responsibility, equal partnership in every decision we make going forward. The room erupted in polite applause, but Doris barely heard it. She was looking at Eric, seeing the question in his eyes, the one that went beyond business titles and corporate structures. He'd asked her last night, in the privacy of his penthouse apartment, where they'd been spending more and more evenings reviewing contracts and discovering each other. The ring was simple, a single diamond set in platinum, designed with clean lines and absolute precision, like a signature that couldn't be forged. She'd said yes in Sicilian, the language of deepest truth. Si, per sempre. Yes, forever. Now standing before the board, Eric reached into his pocket and produced a second document. There's one more announcement. Doris has agreed to become my partner in every sense of the word. We'll be married next month, and I cannot imagine a better foundation for either our personal or professional future. This time, the applause was genuine, surprised, and enthusiastic. Marchetti's smile was the closest thing to paternal pride Doris had ever seen from him. Eric turned to her, speaking quietly enough that only she could hear. Still feel invisible? Doris looked around the room, at the board members congratulating them, at the contracts bearing her signature alongside Eric's, at the city sprawling beyond the windows. She thought about her father's magnifying glass, now displayed in her office in a custom case. She thought about Nonna Lucia's Sicilian wisdom, which had saved a man's empire and built her own future. She thought about 3 years of erasure and one moment of choosing truth over safety. "No," she said, smiling. "I feel indispensable." "Good." Eric pulled her close, and she let him, no longer afraid of being seen. "Because you are. In every possible way." The meeting continued. Plans were presented, contracts were signed, but Doris barely registered the details. She was too busy experiencing something she'd forgotten during 3 years of invisibility: the simple, profound joy of being completely, authentically, gloriously present in her own life. Outside, the city glittered with late afternoon light. Inside, Doris Hall, forensic expert, nurse, strategic analyst, co-CEO, and soon-to-be wife, stood beside the man she'd saved and who'd saved her in return. Visible, powerful, essential, home. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss it. It's as interesting and even more intriguing as you can ever imagine.